year is 1588. Spain is by far the largest superpower in the world. And then there's England, with a ridiculously bad economy. And a ridiculously bad navy. And both of these countries decided to go to war. And on paper, this should be a victory for Spain. On paper, England should get absolutely destroyed. But this is war. And if there's one thing you should know about war, dear viewer, is that war is never fought on paper. Let's go back a few years. In 1556, Philip II was given control of the Netherlands, and in 1567, the Duke of Alba was sent with 10,000 troops to stop a revolt, which worked. But how does that have anything to do with England? Well, England had been trading wool with the Netherlands, which had helped the economy to grow. The wool was affordable and close to the Netherlands, so to them, it was what some might call a bargain. Once Spain blocked trade with England, the English economy took a hit due to the lack of trade. But it got worse for England in 1569. See, a year earlier in 1568, Queen Elizabeth I's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, was kicked out of Scotland after a Scottish Reformation, since Mary remained Catholic despite the country becoming Protestant. So Mary decided to flee to the north of England. Elizabeth, however, was extremely scared that the north may stage an uprising due to them heavily opposing her religious policy. Mary would have been a great person to replace her on the throne with for the north. So Elizabeth immediately took action and transferred Mary to Carlisle Castle and then to Bolton Castle. And so far, the plan was working. Surely nothing could go wrong, right? But Mary wasn't the only threat to Elizabeth. Elizabeth had another threat, this one even closer to home. The Duke of Norfolk, her cousin. He hated the fact that William Cecil, a member of Elizabeth's Privy Council, had a lot of power. Norfolk was also a Catholic sympathiser who was angry at Elizabeth's religious policy. Norfolk originally planned to marry Mary and make her heir to the throne to get more power for himself. Another person who was jealous of Cecil was Robert Dudley, another member of Elizabeth's Privy Council and a close friend of hers. Some even said that he had the teeniest crush on her. He felt guilty though and confessed everything, so Norfolk was exposed. He was forced to flee and imprisoned in 1569. His supporters were furious. Norfolk told his supporters not to rebel, but by this point the damage had already been done. Elizabeth called the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland to court due to suspicion of a rebellion. However, this had the opposite effect and pushed the Earls into action. On November 9th, the two Earls joined forces at Bransett Castle. A bell was immediately rung to call people to rebel, and they listened. 4,600 rebels marched towards London, even illegally holding mass at Durham Cathedral on the 14th of November. They continued to march south, capturing most of the Pennines. Elizabeth was struggling to raise forces to confront them, and by December the rebels had taken Barnard Castle and the port of Hartlepool. There they waited for support from Spain as promised by the Spanish ambassador, and they waited and waited and waited. But the Spanish never came. Why? Because they disliked Mary Queen of Scots. Why? Because she was raised in France and had French origin. And let's just say that the Spanish weren't really the biggest fan of the French. So the Spanish never came, and that was just what Elizabeth needed. She was able to raise an army and immediately got to action. Elizabeth took control of the vital towns of York, Berwick and Pontefract. The rebel earls retreated and finally dispersed their forces, fleeing into Scotland on the 19th of December. Elizabeth had survived, and not just that, she had won the rebellion. Around 450 rebels were executed. The Earl of Westmoreland was able to escape abroad, but as for the Earl of Northumberland, he was betrayed by the Scottish and executed in 1572. The Duke of Norfolk, however, was not, because he was related to Elizabeth. Instead, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London for 9 months and released in August 1570. Elizabeth was officially excommunicated from the Catholic Church by the Pope in his 1570 papal bull. And that was that. After the Northern Rebellion, there were other plots to dethrone Elizabeth, such as the Ridolfi plot, after which Norfolk was executed, the Throckmorton plot, and most notably, the Babington plot. After the Babington plot, Elizabeth's Privy Council had forced Elizabeth into signing Mary Queen of Scots' death warrant, and Mary was executed in 1587. Elizabeth was livid, but so too was King Philip II of Spain, and for him, that was the final straw. In 1588, Philip II gathered his entire fleet of ships and built some more to create the largest fleet of battleships ever seen. I shall create the largest fleet of battleships ever seen. I shall call it lots of big ships. No, hold on a second. That doesn't sound cool. Okay, how about unsinkable? I don't want to jinx it though. How about Royal Caribbean? No, I bet a company's gonna steal that in like the 500 years from now or something. White Star Line? No, that one's also gonna get stolen, I bet. It's probably gonna make a ship that claims to be unsinkable and ends up sinking on its first voyage. And they'll probably make a play about it that suddenly becomes a big hit. And they'll probably use like some actor that was in Romeo and Juliet as the main star of said play. But all jokes aside though, I can't think of a name. I mean, I could call it the Armada. No, hold on a second, that sounds catchy. You know what? Armada it is. Mark my words, they'll be teaching this in history 500 years from now because of our great success. By May, it was ready. Here was the plan for Spain. Depart Lisbon, pick up soldiers in the Netherlands, sail to England, invade, win. Refuse to elaborate. Should be easy, shouldn't it? Spain had a fleet of 151 ships, 7,000 sailors and about 30,000 soldiers and 2,500 guns. Cannons on board were designed to shoot down enemy ships from a distance. Philip's army was also well trained. As for England, they had about 20,000 soldiers, but they were not very well trained, a fleet of 34 ships which was then increased to 200 after trading companies and privateered offered to sell ships to them. So Spain by far had the larger army and the better trained army. Meanwhile, as for tactics, Spain's plan was to maintain the crescent formation. England had smaller and more nimble ships which were able to maneuver faster than the Spanish ships. So, that's essentially the setup, and the two sides were about to go head to head in what would become one of the largest naval battles in history. So, let battle commence.